The vote was 307 to 1. Earth lost. Ambassador Lena Vasquez sat in the great circular chamber of the Galactic Council and did not move. Around her, 700 alien delegates shifted and murmured and congratulated each other with the particular enthusiasm of people who had just done something they knew was wrong and needed noise to drown out the knowing. The chamber was carved from a moon. Its walls were 6 kilometers of polished obsidian that reflected everything back at you. Every face, every gesture. Every coward looking away from the one human sitting alone at the small round table near the back. She did not move. The Vethori delegate, a tall creature with 4 arms and a neck that curved like a question mark, descended from the speaking platform with the slow dignity of someone who had rehearsed this moment. His name was Councillor Merv, and he had spoken for 2 hours before the vote. He had used words like necessary realignment and resource distribution equilibrium and the difficult arithmetic of survival. He had spoken these words in a voice that was soft and reasonable and almost kind, the way a surgeon might explain an amputation, as if the calm of the explanation changed what the knife was going to do. The resolution was simple. Earth's solar system, its asteroid belt, its outer planets, their moons, was hereby designated a common resource zone under Galactic Council jurisdiction. Extraction operations would begin within 6 standard cycles. Earth itself was to be reclassified from emerging sovereign world to protected observation territory, which was a title that sounded generous and meant nothing. It meant humanity would be watched. It meant humanity would not be consulted. It meant the door that had taken 300 years of striving to open had just been shut, locked, and the key thrown into something with no bottom. Merv passed her table on his way out. He paused, his 4 arms folded across his chest in the Vethori gesture of formal acknowledgement, which looked, to human eyes, like a man hugging himself very hard. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said, "you understand this is not personal." She looked at him for a long moment. "It never is," she said. He walked away. The chamber emptied around her in layers, delegates filtering out through a dozen archways, their conversations already moving past the vote to other business, to dinner plans, to the next thing. The resolution was done. It was filed. It was real. The machinery of galactic civilization had chewed through one more agenda item and would move on to the next without breaking stride. Lena sat there until the chamber was empty. Then she opened the small communications terminal built into her table, bypassed 3 levels of Council network protocol with codes that were not supposed to exist, and connected to a channel that was also not supposed to exist. "It passed," she said. The voice on the other end was a man named Admiral Jorah Chen, and he had been waiting in a ship that was also not supposed to exist, in a location that was not on any chart the Council had access to, for exactly this call. "How bad?" he said. "Everything outside Earth orbit, full extraction rights. We've been reclassified to observation status." A pause, not the pause of a man who was shocked. The pause of a man confirming what he already suspected and allowing himself exactly 3 seconds to process it before moving on. "Did they offer anything?" Merv said it wasn't personal. "Right," another pause shorter. "Lena, come home." She closed the terminal, stood, and walked out of the chamber of the Galactic Council for the last time. 300 years. That was how long humanity had been trying. It had not started with ships or weapons or any of the things the other species remembered later when they tried to make sense of what happened. It had started with a signal, a mathematical sequence broadcast from a research station on Titan, picked up by a Vethori explorer ship passing through the outer system. The Vethori had debated what to do with it for 11 years. Then they had come to Earth. They had expected a primitive species. They found a species that had already mapped the human genome, split the atom, walked on their moon, built global communications networks, and written an extraordinary amount of poetry about loneliness. The Vethori did not know what to make of the poetry. They made polite notes about it and moved on. First contact was careful and formal, and required 14 years of negotiation just to establish a shared language framework. Humanity threw itself into that project with a focus that unnerved even the Vethori linguists, who were used to being the smartest people in most rooms. Humans turned out to have an almost pathological gift for language acquisition. They did not just learn Vethori standard. They learned it, then requested access to 11 other council languages, then learned those, then started asking questions about the grammatical structures of languages that had not been spoken for centuries by species that had not existed for longer. It took them 4 years. The Vethori filed a report with the council. The council noted it. The council moved on. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Council as an observing member 40 years after first contact. Not a full member, observing. They could attend sessions. They could speak when called upon. They could not vote. They received a small table near the back of the great chamber carved from a moon, and they sat at it for 260 years, speaking when called upon, watching, waiting. The other species were not cruel. That was the thing Lena had come to understand, sitting at that table through decade after decade of sessions. They were not cruel. They were just thoroughly, completely, almost incomprehensibly certain that humanity did not matter very much. Earth was small. Its sun was unremarkable. Its people were young, clever in certain narrow ways, emotionally erratic by council standards, prone to war among themselves, prone to large feelings they could not always explain, prone to making art about things that had no survival value. The council found them interesting the way one might find an unusual insect interesting. Full membership had been on the table 17 times in 260 years. 17 times it had failed to pass. The reason given was always different. Humanity had not met the technology threshold. Humanity had not demonstrated sufficient political stability. Humanity had not resolved its remaining territorial disputes. Humanity had not achieved the minimum population distribution across multiple star systems. Each time, the goalposts moved, and humanity went home and met the new standard and came back and found new goalposts. By the time Lena Vasquez was appointed ambassador, the 34th human to hold the title, she had stopped believing the goalposts were real. She had started to understand that the council did not want humanity to meet the standard. The council wanted humanity to stay small and manageable and slightly behind, because a humanity that was fully in the room was a humanity that would have opinions and cast votes and complicate things. She had served 12 years working within the system. She had asked, argued, negotiated, presented papers, built coalitions, called in favors, made the case in every language the council possessed. 307 to 1. She understood now. They had never intended to let humanity in. They had needed the asteroid belt for 30 years and had been patient enough to wait for a vote that would look legitimate. The reclassification to observation territory was not a side note. It was the main event. They were not just taking the resources. They were ensuring humanity could not object in any forum that mattered. They had calculated, with the cool arithmetic Merv had described so pleasantly, that humanity would have no choice but to accept it. They had been calculating that for 300 years. They had made one error in their arithmetic. They had never asked what humanity had been doing with the time. The ship was called Unbroken, not officially. Officially, it had a designation that was a long string of numbers and letters that meant nothing, assigned by a project office whose own name was classified above the level of most governments on Earth. But the engineers who built it, who had spent 19 years in a shipyard carved into the dark side of a remote asteroid no council survey had ever flagged as interesting, called it Unbroken, and the name stuck. It was not the only ship. There were 11 of them. While humanity had been sitting at its small table near the back of the council chamber, attending sessions, speaking when called upon, watching, learning, it had also been building, quietly. With the particular patience of a people who had spent 3 centuries absorbing the lesson that patience was the only thing they could afford, because everything else cost leverage they did not have. The engineers who designed Unbroken and her 10 sisters had grown up reading Council technical databases, which humanity had been granted limited access to as a courtesy of observing member status. They had read those databases the way someone reads a map of a country they intend to visit, carefully, systematically, looking not just at what was there, but at the gaps, at the things that were not included, at the edges of Council technology, where no one had pushed because no one had needed to, because no one had been hungry enough. Hunger, it turned out, was a significant engineering advantage. Unbroken was 30 kilometers long, not unusually large by Council standards. The Vithori ran carrier ships twice that size, but size was not the point. The point was what it carried and how it worked, and what its 11 drive cores could do to the physics of a local region of space when they were pushed past what the Council's own best engineers would have said was theoretically possible. They had said it was theoretically possible. They had spent 8 years proving it. Admiral Jorah Chen stood on the bridge of Unbroken and received Lena's call and stood very still for 30 seconds after he closed the channel. Then he turned to his crew. 22 humans at their stations looking back at him. Young, most of them. Calm, all of them. Trained for 8 years for exactly this, for the moment when the call came and the thing they had built stopped being a secret and started being a question that the rest of the galaxy would have to answer. Navigation, Chen said. Sorry. Plot a course for Council Prime. A pause not long. Course plotted, Admiral. Chen looked out through the main viewport at the dark, at the stars that the Council had decided humanity did not matter enough to reach. Signal the fleet, he said. All ships move. Unbroken turned. And in 10 other dark and hidden places in the outer system, 10 other ships that were not supposed to exist turned with her, and together they fell toward the light. The first thing Council Prime's defense grid registered was a gravity anomaly. Not a ship, not 11 ships. A gravity anomaly, the kind of reading that made the technician on duty frown at her screen and tap it twice with one finger, the way you tap a thing you suspect is broken. She was a Keth, blue-skinned, four-eyed, 17 years on the grid watch without a single incident worth reporting. She had a cup of something warm going cold on her left side, and a half-finished schedule rotation form on her right, and she was, in the most complete sense of the phrase, not ready. She tapped the screen a third time. The anomaly did not fix itself. It got bigger. She opened a channel to her supervisor. Sir, she said, I have something. What kind of something? She watched the readings climb. Gravity displacement across a front 300,000 kilometers wide. 11 separate but synchronized signatures. Energy output that her instruments were technically measuring, but that her instruments were also, in some quiet mechanical way, struggling to believe. The kind of something, she said carefully, that I think you should come see yourself. Council Prime was not a planet. It had been once, 300,000 years ago, before the species that built it had done what every species eventually did when it ran out of things to solve. It had started solving the planet itself. Over 30 millennia they had hollowed it, reinforced it, threaded it through with transit lines and reactor cores and data networks so dense that the whole structure hummed at a frequency you could not hear but could feel in your back teeth if you stood still long enough. The surface was cities. The interior was cities. 50 billion beings called it home across 200 species, and it sat at the navigational center of Galactic Council territory like a knot at the center of a web, every thread running back to it. It had not been attacked in 11,000 years. The last species to try had not existed in 11,000 years either. This fact was not lost on Admiral Chen. He had read every account of that engagement in the 3 years he spent planning this approach. He had read them with the particular attention of someone who needed to understand not the victory but the defeat, how the attackers had thought, where they had committed too early, what had made the Council's response so complete. He had taken notes in the margins of the translated texts, in handwriting so small the analysts who later reviewed his files had needed magnification. He was not here to repeat that history. He was here to replace it. Unbroken came out of the fold first. A fold was what the engineers called it, the drive technology that humanity had spent 8 years proving was possible and 12 years learning to weaponize. It did not move a ship through space. It moved space around the ship, compressing the distance between 2 points until they were effectively the same point, and then releasing. The math was elegant. The physics were violent. And the visual effect from the outside was something that no one in council space had seen before because no one in council space had built the drive before. A point of darkness that opened like an eye, and then a ship that fell out of it, already moving, already oriented, already exactly where it intended to be. 30 kilometers of ship. 11 seconds of silence on every council frequency. Then 10 more eyes opened in the dark around it, and 10 more ships fell through. Councillor Merv was in a breakfast meeting when his personal communicator went off. He ignored it. It went off again. He excused himself from the table with the particular smooth grace of a man who had spent 40 years making exits from rooms look deliberate, walked to the corridor, and answered. The voice on the other end was the Defense Coordination Director. Her name was Vel Orath, and she had held the position for 22 years, and in 22 years she had called Merv's personal communicator exactly once before, during a reactor failure in the transit district that had killed 9 people and knocked out communications for a sector. She did not call personal communicators for small things. How many? Merv said, because the look on her face through the small screen told him the shape of the news before the words did. 11, Vel Orath said. Our fleet response time. That's what I'm calling about. A pause. The kind of pause that had weight in it. Counselor. Their first ship came out of fold 40,000 kilometers from Defense Station 7. Merv knew Defense Station 7. Everyone in the Council's security structure knew Defense Station 7. It was the closest hardpoint to the standard Council Prime approach corridor. It was positioned exactly where any attacker would need to pass through. It had been positioned there for a reason, and the reason was that no ship had ever been able to fold that close to a gravitational body the size of Council Prime. The interference was too severe. The margin of error in fold navigation at that range was, according to 300 years of established physics, unsurvivable. Their second ship, Vel Orath continued, came out 41,000, their third at 39. The variance across all 11 ships was less than 2,000 kilometers. Merv stood in the corridor outside his breakfast meeting and looked at the wall. They've solved fold precision, he said. It was not a question. At a level we do not have, Vel Orath said. Counselor, Station 7's targeting solution had a 6-second window when Unbroken emerged. Standard protocol. We fired. And another pause. Their shielding absorbed it. Merv was quiet for 3 seconds. Send me everything, he said, and get me a line to the human ship. Chen received the hail 40 minutes after emergence. 40 minutes. He had expected faster. He had planned for faster. The 40-minute delay was itself a data point. It meant the Council had spent 40 minutes doing something before opening a channel, and what they had been doing was running every weapon they had at station range and watching it not work, and now they were adjusting their approach. He respected that, the adjustment, not the weapons. He accepted the channel. Merv's face appeared on the main screen, 4 arms folded across his chest, the same posture as the Council chamber, composed, reasonable, the surgeon about to explain the knife. Admiral Chen, he said, I confess you have surprised us. I know, Chen said. May I ask what you intend? Chen considered the question. It was, he thought, a good question. Honest in a way Merv had not been honest in the Council chamber. May I ask what you intend? Not you must stand down or this is an act of war or we demand you explain yourselves. May I ask? The question of a man who had just watched his station's weapons absorbed like weather and was recalibrating. "We intend to be heard," Chen said. "You had a vote, 307 to 1. You took our solar system. You reclassified us. You made a decision about what humanity is worth, and then you made it permanent in law with no appeal." He paused. "We are the appeal." Merv's forearms shifted. "What you are doing is illegal under council charter." "We are not a council member," Chen said. "You saw to that." A silence on the channel. "What do you want?" Merv said. "A new vote," Chen said. "Full membership, restoration of our sovereign rights over our solar system, and a formal review of every resolution passed in the last 300 years that was shaped by the assumption that humanity would not be in the room to object." Merv looked at him through the screen for a long moment. "And if the council refuses?" Chen did not answer right away. He turned slightly and looked at his navigation officer. She was a woman named Yara Osai, 29 years old, who had grown up in a coastal city that regularly flooded because the warming earth that the council had found so unremarkable had not finished with it yet. She had a photograph of that city, the old one, the one before the flood walls, folded in her left breast pocket. She had carried it for 11 years. She looked back at him. Her face said nothing that wasn't already settled. He turned back to the screen. "Then we will show you what we built while you were deciding we didn't matter," he said. "And you will vote again. And this time you will understand what the vote actually costs." Merv's forearms unfolded from his chest. It was the first unguarded gesture Chen had seen from him, the Vithori equivalent of a man who had just sat down very hard in a chair. "I need to consult the full council," Merv said. "You have 6 hours," Chen said. He closed the channel. What followed in those 6 hours was not what the council expected. They expected the fleet to hold position, to wait, to perform the patience that humanity had demonstrated for 300 years, that deep institutional stillness of a species that had learned to absorb refusals and come back. Instead, Unbroken moved. Not toward Council Prime, not toward any defensive installation. It moved to the edge of the shipping corridor that fed Council Prime its primary resource stream from the outer belt stations. The same resource stream that the Resolution had been designed to expand using Earth's asteroid belt, and it stopped there. And sat there. It did not fire, it did not broadcast threats. It sat in the corridor the way a stone sits in a river, and the ships that had been inbound to Council Prime along that corridor saw it and stopped. And the ships behind those ships stopped, and within 4 hours, there was a line of freighters and transports stretching back 11 light minutes that was not moving, and was not going to move because no freight captain in the galaxy was going to test whether 30 kilometers of human engineering would hold its position. The Council's Economic Analysis Office sent Merv a report 2 hours into the standstill. The report was 3 pages. The first page was data. The second page was projections. The third page was a single paragraph that, stripped of its formal language, said, "If this continues for 30 days, Council Prime faces a resource shortage that will require emergency rationing across 40% of residential sectors." 30 days. Not years, not decades. 30 days. Merv read the paragraph. He read it again. He set the report face down on his desk. He had spent 40 years in the council. He had written resolutions and voted on resolutions and negotiated resolutions, and he understood, at a level that was almost physical, the way that power worked in the galaxy. Power was not ships. It was not weapons or shields or fold drives that broke the rules of physics. Power was the ability to make the cost of opposing you higher than the cost of accommodating you. Humanity had just made the cost of opposing them extremely clear. And they had done it without firing once. He picked up his communicator. "Call a full session," he said. The second vote happened in 5 hours and 53 minutes. Lena Vasquez was not in the chamber for it. She was standing on the bridge of Unbroken, where Chen had asked her to be when he made the call, because he thought she should hear it in a room with people who had built toward this moment for the better part of their lives. She stood next to the navigation console where Yara Osai was tracking the inbound feeds, and she watched the count come in. 301 to 7. In favor of humanity. No one on the bridge cheered. No one shouted. Yara Osai reached into her left breast pocket and took out the photograph of the city that used to flood and looked at it for a moment and then put it back. And that was the closest thing to a celebration that the Bridge of Unbroken produced. Chen received the formal transmission from Mayor's office 3 minutes later. He read it. He set it on the console. He looked at his crew. "We'll hold position until the membership documentation is filed," he said. "Navigation, keep the corridor blocked until confirmation comes through." "Yes, sir." He walked to the viewport. Stars. The same stars that the Council had spent 300 years deciding humanity did not matter enough to reach. They looked the same. They were not the same. "Sir," said his communications officer, "we're getting signals from a lot of places. News networks, diplomatic channels, other species governments." A pause. "Some of them are calling the fleet." "What are they saying?" The communications officer, a young man, 24, who had never known an Earth that had not been negotiating with the stars, looked at his screen. "They want to know," he said, "who we are." Chen looked at the stars. "Tell them," he said, "we're the species that was in the back of the room." He let that sit for a moment. "Tell them we moved up. The galaxy had opinions." It always did. That was the thing about 50 billion beings spread across 200 species living in a structure carved from a dead planet. They had opinions about everything, and the opinions arrived fast and loud and contradicted each other completely. And the Council's information networks carried all of them simultaneously like a river carrying everything it had ever touched. The opinion that spread fastest was fear. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that moves through a population the way cold moves through a building with a broken window, not a gust, just a slow dropping of temperature that you notice only when you realize you've been sitting in your coat indoors for an hour without thinking about it. The Vithori home networks ran the footage of Unbroken coming out of Fold on a loop. 30 kilometers of ship. Dropping out of nothing. 40,000 kilometers from a hardpoint that was supposed to be unreachable. They ran it without commentary for the first 2 hours because no one in the network's editorial structure could agree on what commentary was appropriate. Eventually, someone found a retired Vethori defense analyst who was willing to appear on screen and say measured things in a measured voice, and they put him on, and he said, "Fold precision of that caliber represents a generational gap in drive technology," and the networks ran that phrase, generational gap, under the footage until it was burned into every screen on the Vethori homeworld. Generational gap. 2 words doing the work of a panic. The Keth response was different. The Keth were engineers, had been for 6,000 years, the way some species are builders in their bones, not because they chose it, but because their particular combination of curiosity and stubbornness, and the number of fingers they had made tools feel like an extension of thought rather than a product of it. They had built Defense Station 7. They had built half the Council's transit infrastructure. They were, in the quiet accounting that no one did openly but everyone maintained, the species most responsible for the physical fact of Council Prime existing as it did. When the footage arrived on Keth networks, the reaction was silence. Then the engineers started talking. Not about the threat, about the drive. How did they solve the gravitational interference problem? That was the question moving through Keth engineering forums within 6 hours of the emergence. Not in the language of alarm, but in the language of a puzzle that someone else had solved, and you had not, and that fact was sitting in your chest like a stone you had not noticed until just now. Someone had solved it. Humans had solved it. With less time, less funding, less access to Council technical resources, humans had solved the problem that Keth engineers had categorized as theoretically approachable in perhaps 2 to 3 centuries, and had apparently done so in less than 20 years. The Keth Director of Engineering Sciences sent a formal request to humanity's new council office within 8 hours of the vote. The request was for a technical exchange program. The Sarin were afraid. That was the simplest truth of it. The Sarin were a small species, small in number, small in territory, small in the particular way that 300 years of being a minor power in a large galaxy makes you small, and they had a long memory. Their ancestors had been absorbed into a larger civilization twice before they found the council, and the finding had felt like rescue, and they had been loyal to that rescue ever since, with the loyalty of a people who remember what the alternative felt like. They did not want a new power. They had been comfortable. The Sarin ambassador to Council Prime was a woman named Teth Ran, and she sat in her office the morning after the vote and looked at the feeds and felt something she had not felt in 40 years of diplomatic work. She felt the ground moving. Not literally, metaphorically, in the way that people who have spent their lives building on a foundation feel it when the foundation shifts, a wrongness that has no single location, that is everywhere and nowhere, that makes every surface you put your hand on feel slightly less solid than it did yesterday. She sent a private message to her home government. The humans are stronger than we knew. This is not the end. This is the beginning of a very long question. She did not specify what the question was. Her government did not ask. Lena Vasquez was doing paperwork. This was the thing that no one in the council chamber, or on the bridge of Unbroken, or on any of the Vethori or Keth or Sarin networks talking about generational gaps and technical exchanges and the ground moving. No one was thinking about the paperwork. But the paperwork was real, and it was enormous, and it arrived on Lena's desk the morning after the vote in the form of 47 separate council administrative filings, each of which represented one part of the bureaucratic machinery required to translate a vote into an actual legal reality. Full membership meant forms. It meant classifications and designations and official entries in 12 different council registries, and the reassignment of Earth's solar system from Common Resource Zone back to sovereign territory, which itself required 11 sub-filings that each had to be completed in council standard and cross-referenced with the original resolution that had created the wrong designation, and annotated to explain why the wrong designation was being corrected. The annotation field had a maximum of 500 words. Lena needed 600. She was sitting at the small round table that had been her family's address in the council chamber for 34 ambassadors and 300 years. They had given her a better office now, larger, near the front, with windows that looked out over the transit district. But she had come back to this table because the new office did not have a chair that fit her right, and because she did not trust things that were given to her quickly after 300 years of being given nothing. Councillor Mayer found her there. He came without his staff, without the formal posture. He walked through the chamber, which was empty at this hour, and sat down across from her small table, which was too small for 2 people, but he sat anyway, and he folded all 4 of his arms on the table's surface and looked at her. "How long did you know?" he said. She did not look up from the annotation field immediately. She finished her sentence, then she looked at him. "Chen started the shipyard project 19 years ago," she said. "I've known about it for 12. While you were here." "While I was here." Merv was quiet. His 4 arms were still on the table. "You were negotiating in good faith." "Yes." "While knowing that if the negotiation failed." "There was a second option," Lena said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. "That is a very human thing to do," he said. It was not an insult. It was not a compliment. It was the careful observation of a man who was updating something fundamental. "I know," she said. "May I ask why you did not simply use the ships from the beginning?" Lena set down her pen. She looked at the table, her table, the back of the room table, the table that 33 people before her had sat at and spoken from when called upon. "Because we wanted in," she said, "not over." Merv looked at the table too. And now? Now we're in. She picked up her pen. Which means the ship stay parked, as long as everything we were promised actually happens. And if it doesn't? She looked at him. He understood. He unfolded his arms and stood, and walked out of the chamber, and left her to her paperwork. Chen kept the fleet at Council Prime for 3 more days. He did not announce this as a threat. He did not broadcast it as a warning. He filed standard docking requests, as any fleet would, and the requests were processed with a speed that would have been unimaginable a week ago, and the ships moved to assigned positions in the outer transit ring. 11 ships parked in a row. Visitors came. Not officially, not as diplomatic delegations with credentials and formal protocols. They came the way curious people always come when there is something they cannot explain and cannot stop thinking about quietly and on foot, and they stood in the transit ring's observation bays and looked at the ships through the glass. Keth engineers mostly. Some Vethori, some species Chen did not recognize. They stood there and looked at Unbroken, at its length, at the drive housings that even at rest had an energy signature that their instruments measured in units that did not quite fit the instrument scales, at the hull plating which was dark and smooth and showed no damage at all from Station 7's weapons, not a mark, not a scorch. A Keth engineer named Osvel stood in the observation bay for 2 hours. She had been designing ship hulls for 30 years. She had a doctorate in materials behavior under energy impact and another in phase transition metallurgy. She was, in the opinion of the Keth Engineering Council, the best hull specialist currently working. She stood in the observation bay and looked at the human hull. She could not identify the material. She had run 4 scans and the readings made no sense, not because the instruments were broken, but because the readings were internally consistent and the material they described should not exist, should not be possible to manufacture, should not hold its structure under the energy inputs that Station 7's weapons would have delivered. She stood there for 2 hours. Then she went back to her office and sent a message to the Keth Director of Engineering Sciences. "Make the exchange request formal," she said, "and make it generous." On the 3rd day, Chen received a message from Earth. Not from the government, not from the military command structure, from his daughter, who was 9 years old and lived in a city that used to flood and now had flood walls and was currently, according to the message, in the middle of a school project about the Galactic Council and had a question. The question was, "Dad, are we going to be okay now?" He read the message twice. He was sitting in his quarters on Unbroken, in the dark, with the viewport showing the transit ring and the observation bays, where even at this hour there were shapes standing at the glass, looking. He wrote back. "I think so," he said. "Tell me about the project." She messaged back in 4 seconds because she had been waiting. She told him about the project. He read every word. Outside the viewport in the observation bays, the shapes kept coming. Different species, different hours, same posture, standing still, looking at the ship, trying to understand what they were looking at. Chen knew what they were doing. He had done it himself once, standing in the shipyard in the dark, looking at the hull of Unbroken before her first systems test, trying to hold in his head the full fact of what they had made. Not just the ship, the 19 years, the engineers who had given up other careers, the funding that had come from 30 governments pooling resources quietly over a decade, the physics papers that had been published under false names to avoid council attention, the fold tests that had failed 9 times before they succeeded. All of it in the hull. All of it in 30 kilometers of ship floating in a transit ring, while 50 billion beings on a carved-out planet tried to decide what kind of universe they were living in now. He closed the message from his daughter. He looked at the shapes of the glass. He thought, good. Look, we were always here. You just weren't paying attention. The Drivari did not send a message. They sent a ship. One ship, Carrier class. Older than the council resolution that had just flipped humanity's status. Older than Lena's tenure. Older than the careers of most of the people now scrambling through Council Prime's defense coordination offices trying to decide what the correct response was to a vessel that had just dropped out of fold on the wrong side of the transit perimeter without filing an approach declaration, and was now sitting there, quiet, broadcasting nothing. The Drivari did this. It was a known thing about them. They communicated in positions, in the physical fact of where they put themselves and how much space they took up and how long they stayed. Words, to the Drivari, were furniture. You used them to fill a room. The room itself was what mattered. The room they were currently furnishing said, "We are watching and we have not decided yet." Chen received the report at 3:40 ship time. He was not asleep. He had not been fully asleep in 4 days, a fact he had not shared with anyone because the crew was watching him the way crews watch commanding officers in new territory. Not for orders, but for whether the person giving the orders still believed in the orders, which was a different thing entirely and harder to fake. He read the report. He set it on the console. He looked at it. "Navigation," he said. "Sir." "The Drivari ship, what's its weapons posture?" A pause, the pause of someone checking twice. "All systems cold, Admiral." "Shields up, passive configuration." He picked up the report again. Shields up but weapons cold was not an attack posture. It was not a retreat posture. It was the posture of something that had walked into a room and put its back against the wall and was watching the exits. He understood that posture. He had spent 19 years in it. "Hold our position," he said. "Do not hail them, do not move toward them, do not move away." His communications officer turned. "Sir, Council Defense is requesting we." "I know what they're requesting," Chen said. "Hold." The Drivari had not voted. That was the thing that sat in the back of Chen's mind like a splinter, small, specific, impossible to stop touching. 307 to 1. One was Earth. The Drivari had abstained, not voted against, not voted for, abstained, filed a formal declaration of non-participation and left the chamber before the count. He had read the abstention 3 times when Lena forwarded it. He had underlined the word non-participation. Abstentions happened. Species abstained for political reasons, for resource reasons, because they didn't care, because caring cost something they weren't ready to spend. But the Drivari abstention had come with a declaration, which was unusual, and the declaration had contained one sentence, which was, "This council is making a decision it will not be able to unmake." Not a moral objection. A prediction. The Drivari ship stayed for 6 hours. It did not communicate. It did not maneuver. It held its position at the edge of the transit perimeter and ran its passive sensors and watched. And Unbroken held its position and did not hail them and did not flinch. And the 2 ships sat across that distance from each other like 2 people who have something important to say and have agreed without discussing it that the first one to speak loses something. On the 5th hour, Chen's communications officer said, "Admiral." Quietly, the way you say a word when you are not sure it's the right time for the word. Chen looked at him. "The Drivari ship is running a scan on us. Active, detailed. They're not hiding it." "I know," Chen said. He had seen the scan initiate 20 minutes ago and said nothing because saying something would have changed what the scan meant. Let them look. That was the point. Let them look. He knew what they were going to find because he knew what was in the hull. He knew the drive specifications. He knew the shield output. He knew that an active detailed scan of Unbroken at this range, run through Drivari sensor systems that were, he would give them this, genuinely excellent, would produce readings that would take their analysts approximately 2 days to stop arguing about. He waited. On the 6th hour, the Drivari ship moved. Not toward Unbroken, not toward Council Prime. It oriented toward the fold point it had arrived from, and it held that orientation for 4 minutes, which in Drivari positional language meant something his cultural briefings had called settled intention, meaning they had decided something, meaning the watching was over. Then it folded out. Gone. His communications officer let out a breath. Not loud, just the kind of breath that escapes when you have been holding something in your chest for 6 hours and you have just been given permission to put it down. What do you think they decided? He said. Chen looked at the space where the Drivari ship had been. That we're real, he said. The Sethkai ambassador requested a meeting 2 days later. The Sethkai were not a species Chen had spent much time on in his briefings. Mid-tier power, 8 systems, long history of sitting with whichever coalition was currently winning, which was not cowardice so much as a very old and very practical policy shaped by the particular geography of sitting between 3 larger powers, and having learned across several thousand years that strong opinions were expensive. The Sethkai ambassador's name was something that did not translate well, and so everyone called him Reth, which he tolerated. Reth met Chen in a docking bay conference room on Council Prime. Small room, round table, no staff on either side, which was Reth's request and which Chen had granted because a request to meet without staff from a species that had voted against humanity 3 days ago was worth a round table in a small room. Reth was tall, thin in the way that looked structural, as if removing any part of him would cause a problem. His eyes were on the sides of his head, which gave him a field of vision that made sitting across from him feel slightly off. You were never quite in the center of what he was looking at. He sat down. He placed both hands flat on the table. I want to discuss trade, he said. Chen looked at him for a moment. We voted against you, Reth said, because he was a practical species with a practical ambassador, and practical species did not spend time pretending the obvious was not there. We voted against you because Councillor Merv's office indicated the resolution would pass by a larger margin than it did, which would have made our opposition to it economically costly and politically pointless. But it didn't pass by that margin, Chen said. No. 1 vote. 1, Reth agreed, which means we paid the cost of opposing you without the benefit of being on the correct side. He adjusted his hands on the table. We would like to correct the alignment. Chen studied him, the side-set eyes, the structural thinness, the hands flat and open on the table, which he had been told was a Sethkai gesture of disclosed intent. No weapons, no hidden cards. This is what I have. This is what I want. What kind of trade? Chen said. Access to your shipyard infrastructure. Chen was quiet. Not the designs, Reth said. Not the drives, the infrastructure, the construction methodology. Your shipyards produced 11 vessels of that class in 19 years with a workforce that the Council's intelligence community has now determined was approximately 40,000 people. A pause. The Keth built a carrier-class ship with 60,000 workers in 30 years. They are the best shipbuilders in Council space. Word, Chen said. The word landed in the room and sat there. Reth's side-set eyes moved slightly. Both of them, together. A very small movement that Chen's briefings had characterized as the Sethkai equivalent of a blink of recognition. Reth agreed. Yes, that is the correct tense. He spread his hands slightly wider on the table. We have 7 systems and 8 billion people and 3 trade routes that run through Sethkai space that the larger powers have been managing the pricing on for 200 years. We have been, he paused, choosing the word, patient. And there it was. The thing under the table. Chen heard it the way you hear a frequency just at the edge of your range, not quite clear, but present enough to be certain. They were not here about trade. They were here because a species that had been patient for 200 years had just watched a species that had been patient for 300 years run 11 ships into the center of everything and flip a vote and not fire once. They were here because the thing they had been waiting 200 years for had just proved it was possible. Chen looked at Reth. What are you actually asking? He said. Reth looked back at him, sideways technically, with those side-set eyes, but the effect was direct, And for a moment, the practical species practical ambassador veneer went somewhere, and something older came through. Something that had been sitting in a small room at the back of a large chamber for a long time. "We are asking," Reth said, "if there is room at your table." Chen did not answer immediately. He stood up, walked to the small viewport in the conference room wall that looked out at the transit ring, at Unbroken, at the other 10 ships in their row. He thought about Lena at her small table doing her paperwork with the annotation field that was too short. He thought about the engineers in the dark of the asteroid shipyard who had gone home to families they could not tell things to for 19 years. He thought about Yara Osei's photograph. He turned back. "We'll need to talk to our government," he said. "This is above my authority." "Understood." But he paused, picked the next words like you pick something fragile off a high shelf, unofficially, as one person who waited a long time talking to another. Reth waited. "The table we had," Chen said, "was too small. We're building a bigger one." He looked at Reth. "Show us you mean it. Vote with us on the resource zone reversal filing next session. When it costs you something, then we'll talk." Reth stood. Both hands came off the table. He held them open at his sides, which Chen's briefing said was the full version of the gesture, not just no weapons but no reservations. "Done," he said. He left. Chen stood in the empty conference room for a while. Then he went back to the bridge and started drafting a report to Earth that was going to be very long and very complicated, and was going to require a lot of people to read it and argue about it, and eventually decide things he was not authorized to decide alone. He was fine with that. Outside the viewport, Unbroken sat in the transit ring, and species that were not Keth and not Vethori stood in the observation bays now. Different shapes, different sizes, all of them doing the same thing. Looking. Recalculating. Deciding which side of a very new history they wanted to be on before the choosing got expensive. Chen watched them through the glass. He thought, good. "Come look. We've got room." The Mureth fleet came in hot. No declarations, no hails, no positioning language, no abstention filed, no round table in a small room. 17 ships dropping out of fold in a spread formation. Weapons live, shields at maximum output, moving at a speed that said they had decided something before they left and had not reconsidered once on the way. 17. Against 11. The math was the kind that looked settled. Chen was on the bridge when the proximity alert fired. He had been on the bridge for 6 hours already, not because anything had been scheduled, but because he was a man who had spent 19 years building toward a moment and was constitutionally unable to be anywhere else when the moment had a chance of arriving. He looked at the formation on the tactical display. He did not move. "All ships," he said, "battle stations." The Murath had voted against humanity all 17 times. Not abstained, not missed sessions, voted, every single time. Filed written objections twice, which was unusual enough that the Council Archive had flagged them as a point of historical note. Their objections had used the language of civilizational readiness and developmental maturity thresholds, which were the polite words, and in private, in the communications that humanity's intelligence apparatus had been quietly collecting for 11 years, they had used different words. Words that translated roughly as infestation, an unchecked variable, and the thing you let in the door that you cannot put back outside. They had watched the vote reverse. They had watched the fleet park in the transit ring. They had watched the observation bays fill with other species running scans, asking questions, filing exchange requests. They had watched the Sethkai meet with Chen. And they had decided not to negotiate, not to abstain, not to file a written objection or request a procedural review or use any of the 100 instruments that the Council existed to provide for exactly this kind of disagreement between member species. They had decided that the thing you let in the door, you could still remove. You just had to be fast enough. They were not fast enough. The first volley from the Murath lead ship crossed the distance in 4 seconds. It hit Unbroken's shields, and the shields took it the way stone takes rain, present, registered, absorbed, unchanged. Osvel, the Keth hull specialist who had stood in the observation bay for 2 hours, would later publish a technical paper about what happened to the Murath weapons output on contact with Unbroken's defensive field. The paper would be 60 pages. The 60 pages would reduce, for any reader willing to follow the math, to 1 sentence. The Murath brought the wrong tools. Unbroken returned fire. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows the first shot in a fight where one side did not know what the other side had. It is not the silence of shock. It is earlier than shock. It is the half-second before the brain has finished processing the information that what it expected and what happened are different things, and that the difference is large, and that the large difference has immediate consequences for decisions already made and actions already in motion. The Murath formation had that silence for approximately 3 seconds after Unbroken's return fire landed. 3 seconds is a long time. In 3 seconds, a lot of hull can stop existing. The Murath ship that took the shot directly did not explode. Chen had been very specific about that in the engagement protocols he had written over the past 3 nights. Not because he was merciful, not exactly, but because an explosion left nothing to look at, and he needed the other 16 Murath ships to look at something. He needed them to have 3 seconds of silence to look at a ship that had been hit and was still there, but was not, in any functional sense, a warship anymore. Depowered, drifting, intact enough to be rescued, gone from the fight the way you pull a tooth present and absent at once, the socket where a thing was. 1 ship. 1 shot. The silence. Then his communications officer said, "Admiral, the Murath formation is." "I see it," Chen said. The formation was not attacking. It was not retreating. It was doing the thing that formations do when the commanding ship has just experienced something that does not fit the pre-departure briefing. It was holding. 17 ships minus 1, which was now 16 ships, holding position at firing range and not firing, which meant someone in that formation was making a decision, and making it fast. "Hail them," Chen said. The Murath commander who appeared on screen was old. Old in the way of a species that did not age gently. The Murath lived long and the living showed on them, accumulated visibly like rings in wood, layer on layer, the years worn in the surface of the face rather than hidden in it. His name was Commander Sath, and he had 4 campaign decorations visible on his uniform, which meant he had been in 4 engagements the Murath considered significant, and the fact that he was still alive meant those engagements had gone well for him. He looked at Chen. Chen looked back. "You have 1 ship disabled," Chen said. "I have 10 ships that have not fired. You have 16 ships that have fired 1 volley." A pause. "Would you like to have a conversation, or would you like to find out what 10 ships firing looks like?" Sath did not answer immediately. He looked at something to his left, off-screen, the tactical display probably, the readings from Unbroken's 1 shot, and his face did the thing that Merv's face had done in the council chamber, that Reth's face had done in the conference room, that the Keth hull specialist's face had done in the observation bay. The thing where a thing you believe to be settled turns out to be unsettled. The recalculation, quiet, interior, happening behind the eyes. "What do you want?" Sath said. "Your fleet to stand down," Chen said. "All weapons cold, all shields passive. And then we talk. And if we don't stand down..." Chen looked at him. "Then you'll find out," he said, "what we built the other 10 ships for." The Murath stood down. Not fast, not with grace. It took 9 minutes and 2 more hails and 1 point where Sath went off-screen for 4 minutes while his officers presumably told him things. He did not want to hear about the energy signatures coming off Unbroken's drive cores at idle. Things that suggested the 1 shot fired had not been the ship at effort, had not been anywhere near the ship at effort, had been the ship making a point with the smallest possible fraction of what it had. But they stood down. All weapons cold, All shields passive, 16 ships and one drifting socket. The silence after was different from the silence before. Before had been the silence of a gap between what someone expected and what happened. After was the silence of the gap closing, of something settling into a new position that it would not move from. Chen exhaled through his nose. "Get me a medical ship for the disabled vessel," he said, "and tell the council's diplomatic office we're going to need a room." The room they needed was big. Not the conference room with the round table. The council chamber itself, the one carved from a moon, 6 kilometers of obsidian that reflected everything back at you. It was called for an emergency session 40 hours after the Murath engagement, and for the first time in the chamber's recorded history, every seat was filled. Not just the named delegations, the observer galleries, the staff alcoves. Every surface that a body could occupy had one on it, because the thing that had happened in those 40 hours, the footage, the readings, the detailed accounts from 16 Murath captains who had filed individual incident reports with varying degrees of disbelief in their language, had moved through council space at the speed that information moves when it is the kind that changes something fundamental, which is faster than any ship, faster than any drive, old or new. Humanity sat at the front. Not the small round table near the back. Full member seating, center ring, plaque installed that morning by a council administrative crew who had processed the emergency seating request with a speed that would have been unimaginable 2 weeks ago. Lena sat at that seat. She sat straight, both hands flat on the table, the posture of someone who has stopped waiting. Merv opened the session from the speaking platform. He was composed. He was always composed. He gave a summary of events in the order they had occurred, in the flat voice of a man who understood that the events did not need his editorial assistance to make their point. The Murath ambassador requested the floor. Lena did not look at him while he spoke. She looked at the table, her name on the plaque. She had not touched the plaque yet. She thought she would later, when the chamber was empty, run her fingers across the letters the way you run your fingers across something you stopped believing in for a while and then found again. The Murath ambassador spoke for 12 minutes. He did not apologize. That was not what the speech was. It was something more complicated than an apology. It was an argument for why the engagement had been a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, which was a speech she had heard before, in different words, for 300 years, from a species that was not the Murath. It was the argument that people make when they have done the wrong thing for internally consistent reasons, and cannot yet bring themselves to say the word wrong, but are willing to stand at the edge of it. She let him finish. Then she stood. She had not planned a speech. She had notes, 3 pages, careful, drafted over 2 sleepless nights, full of the formal language that 3 decades in the council had put in her fingers. The language of resolutions and declarations and whereas and therefore, and the machinery of civilized disagreement. She did not use the notes. She looked at the chamber, all of it, every filled seat, every reflected face in the obsidian walls, every species that had voted and abstained and watched and run scans and stood in observation bays and filed exchange requests and threatened and backed down. 300 years, she said. The chamber was very quiet. 300 years we sat in the back. We spoke when we were called on. We met every standard you set and then met the new one when you moved it. We wrote papers in your languages. We learned your histories. We asked and argued and came back after every no. She paused. We were also building, not because we wanted war, because we understood very early that the only language that this chamber actually speaks fluently is the language of consequences. She let that land. The ships will remain, she said, not as a threat, as a fact, the way your ships are a fact, the way your stations are a fact. We are in this galaxy and we have been for 300 years and we are not going to be reclassified or resource stripped or voted small again. She looked at the Murath ambassador. And anyone who brings a fleet to test that fact will find out that we built 11 ships and stopped, not because 11 was the limit. She sat down. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the Sethkai ambassador, Reth, Practical Reth, who had met with Chen and promised a vote, and delivered it 2 days ago at a cost that had already drawn 3 formal complaints from the Vethori trade bloc, put both hands flat on his delegation's table. Open, no weapons, no reservations. And he started to clap. It was not a human gesture. The Sethkai did not clap, but he had watched the human feeds. He had done his research. And he put his hands together and made the sound once, twice, and then across the chamber slowly. Something caught, not applause. Not exactly, different species expressing the same thing in different physical ways. A ripple of sound and movement spreading from the center ring outward through the galleries, until the chamber that had been carved from a moon and had reflected 300 years of humanity's exclusion was reflecting something different. Lena put both hands flat on her table. She looked at the plaque with her name on it. She did not cry. She had done all her crying already, over 34 years in this room, in languages that had no word for what it felt like to be the person at the small table near the back. She just sat there and let the chamber be loud for once. Chen received the feed on Unbroken's bridge. He watched Lena stand, watched her speak, watched Reth's hands come together. Around him, 22 people at their stations were watching the same feed on their secondary screens, watching it in the quiet way of people who did not want to be seen watching it, who had learned a long time ago to keep the important things close and still. Yara Ose was not watching the feed. She was looking out the viewport. At the stars. Chen walked over to her station, stood next to her, looked at what she was looking at. The transit ring, the ships, the observation bays still with shapes in them, species still coming, still pressing their faces to the glass. You think it holds, Yara said. Not a question exactly. The kind of thing you say when you already know what you think and you want to hear what the other person thinks to see if the two things match. Chen looked at the stars. He thought about his daughter's message, still unanswered in the back half of his queue, buried under 17 flag-level communications, and the Murath incident reports, and the Keth exchange proposal, and a formal invitation from the Sarin diplomatic corps that he had not yet opened. He thought about the engineers who had gone home to families they couldn't tell things to for 19 years. He thought about the 34 people who had sat at that small table, speaking when called upon, waiting, carrying forward the particular weight of being almost included. He thought about the 307 to 1. Yeah, he said. He did not say, because we built 11 ships and they know we stopped counting. He did not say, because the Sethkai voted and the Keth want the exchange and the Drivari came to look and decided we were real. He did not say, because fear and respect are not the same thing, and we are going to spend the next 300 years making sure the galaxy learns the difference. He just said, yeah. And Yara Ose looked at the stars and said nothing back, which was the right answer. Unbroken sat in the transit ring. The shapes kept coming to the glass. And somewhere in a chamber carved from a moon, an ambassador whose name was now on a plaque sat at a table in the center of the room, and the room was loud, and it had taken 300 years to make it loud, and she let it be.